Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll focus on pawn endgames, double pawns, and outside passed pawns. Let's start with the first example. Here we go. In this position, we have equal number of pawns. However, we can notice that black has doubled pawns on the C file. This is very typical from the Ruy-Lopez, especially the exchange variation, or if white trades the bishop for the knight at some later point. Generally, we consider that half a pawn advantage. The problem for black here is that white's 3 pawns on the queen side can hold off all 4 of the black pawns on the same part of the chessboard. In the meantime, white has a pawn majority on the other side of the board, and therefore white can win the game. Let's see how all of this works out in practice. White can start, for example, by playing c4 and making sure that black will not be able to create a passed pawn on the queen side of the board. For example, if black right now would respond by playing b5, then of course we would not trade the pawn, which would be a mistake, allowing black to undouble his pawns. Let's go back. After c4, b5, the white has 2 good moves. One of it is to advance the pawn, and the other one is to defend the pawn by playing b3. And then again, black will have no way to make progress and to create a passed pawn on the queen side. Let's go back and see what happens if black plays c5 right now. What white wants to do is to run black out of pawn moves on the queen side, and then the black king will need to go back, being in zugzwang and letting the white king and pawn advance further. White plays b3 and black plays a5, kind of sitting and waiting, and white advances the f-pawn. If black doesn't want the white king and pawn, the f-pawn, to advance, then black better doesn't move the king. The problem is that the pawn moves on the other side of the board will run out real quick. a4, b6, and now king f4. And now black has no more moves that wouldn't lose a pawn. Let me just repeat this. Now black has no more useful pawn moves on the queen side, because after b5, white can simply capture that pawn. And after c4, which seemingly creates a passed pawn finally, black arrives too late. b6, and after c3, white will catch the black pawn, while black will not achieve the same. The black king is too far from white's b6 pawn. Let's go back. After f5, let's see how the game can progress if black plays king f7 on the other hand. King e5 and king e7. f6, king f7 and king f5. As we can see, black is being forced to go backwards with the king as the pawn moves are running out. b6, king g5, c6, and the simplest way is to play a4, avoiding any kind of counterplay. b5, and now white has various ways to win. White can simply play king f5, ignoring black's counterplay on the other side of the board and making sure these pawns remain doubled. takes, take back, king f8, king g6, and now all of a sudden not only that the white king is helping the f-pawn, but is also going after the h5 pawn, and then the king will accompany the two passed pawns on the king's side and easily win. That is of course not to say that instead of playing king f5 in this position, white could not take the pawn, because even capturing on b5 would have given white a winning advantage. For example, after a4, b6, a3, b7, a2, pawn promotes to a queen first before black, black promotes to o2, and now queen c7. Black king must move out, otherwise it will get checkmated. Queen e7, king d5, f7 also gives white a winning position. In this type of endgames, there may be various ways to win. However, the easiest is to avoid any counterplay and not even worry about the opponent allowing to promote the pawn and get a queen and give checks, which you never know, may be perpetual checks. So therefore, the simpler solution was, if we go back to this key position in this endgame, to just play king f5, and then black will lose without any counterplay or hope. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This is another pawn endgame where white has doubled pawns. Although the good news is for white that it's an extra one, so the second pawn is an extra one. Generally, in that case, it's not that bad to have a double pawn. However, in this case, black can win the game regardless of being a pawn down. This is a crucial moment in the game, as if the black king would need to go backwards, that would miss the opportunity of winning. Here, black should play g5 right away. The idea is to provoke the white king of moving towards the other side of the board from where most of the pawns are. So black's game plan is to try to get rid of all the king's side pawns and then be left only with the pawns on the other side of the board. And then for a black king to be closer to all of those pawns, I'm talking about the pawns on the A and B files, and then run after those pawns, and the white king would arrive to counterattack the black pawns on A6 and B5 too late. Let's see how this works out in reality. White takes, black takes back. Now white has two choices: to capture the pawn or not to capture it. If white wants to hang on to the e4 pawn and move back, black will capture on e5, king f3, and then g4, provoking the same idea to get rid of this g and e pawn and then run after white's b and a pawns. Of course, white can try not to capture it, but black simply keeps pushing the pawn and keeps pushing it until it almost becomes a queen, and white will have no choice but leave the protection of the e4 pawn and capture black's pawn. And then we achieved our goal from black's perspective. King captures, king f2, king d3, and as we can tell, the black king arrives first, attacking white's pawns, capture it, and even though white can protect the b4 pawn temporarily, after king a4, white again gets into zugzwang, and the king will need to move, and the b4 pawn will fall. Let's go back to the earlier part of this endgame and see what happens if indeed the king does capture the pawn on g5. Then king takes e5, and now white is helpless against the attack on the e4 pawn. For example, If white right now plays a4, a tricky move, because now black has to be accurate. If black would carelessly exchange this pair of pawns and then capture on e4, all of a sudden the game would be a draw. Why? Because the a pawn, that is a rook pawn, gives a lot bigger chance for escape for the other side than any other pawn would. In such positions, all white needs to do is to reach any one of these 6 squares, of course before the black pawn promotes. So for example, white would play a5, black would run after the pawn, and the white king would simply run into the corner, forget about trying to protect that pawn, and just run here. And even if the black king would be on a2 or b3, it wouldn't matter. The position still would be a draw. So this is what white would be shooting for. However, fortunately for black, in this position, black can do better. Black needs to make sure that a pawn on the b file will be kept on the board, or even better, if both pawns can remain. Therefore, b4 is the most accurate move in this position. For example, white plays a5, king e4, king f6, but the black king is running too quick to attack the white pawn, and white's counterattack on the a6 pawn comes just too late. Black's pawn promotes very fast, and now it's an easy win for black. Simply king a8, king c6, and if a7, checkmate immediately arrives. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this endgame, again, we can see the doubled e pawns for black. However, in this position again, black has an extra pawn, so really it's not such a bad thing. However, oftentimes, in order to make progress, we need to transform one type of advantage to a different kind. And that's exactly the case here. Black needs to convert his material advantage to positional advantage. And the way to do that is to immediately give up one of the two doubled pawns. And that correct move is to play e4. Let's see first what happens if indeed white accepts this sacrifice. Now it's a key moment, and it's where to go with the king. The more natural looking king e5 that threatens to go after white's g4 pawn would not work, because the white king would arrive just on time by playing king e3 and not allowing the black king to enter. And what's important here is that black does not have a little waiting move. For example, if the black pawn on e6 wouldn't be there, but would be on e7, all of a sudden black would play e6, and white would be in zugzwang, and the black king then would gain entry to one of the critical squares on f4 or d4. But in this case, the pawn is there, and therefore king e5 in this position would be a major mistake, would give away the win all of a sudden. The only correct move here is to move to the other side, namely to c5. Now, if white wants to maintain opposition and moves to king c3, unlike in the previous example, comment, when black did not have a waiting move, right now black does have just that and can play e5. And now, if in this position, if it was black's turn again, the game would be a draw. However, because it is white's turn, white must give up the opposition between the two kings, and we are talking about opposition in pawn endgames when the two kings are opposite each other on the same file or sometimes rank on the same color square, and there is 1, 3, or 5 squares in between them. But the short distance opposition is 1 square in between the two kings, and the two kings are on the same colors. So the problem here is that if the white king moves in one direction, the opponent king will move to the other direction, or in turn, if the king moves to d3, then the king moves to b4. And now, importantly, the pawn on e5 prevents the white king from moving forward, and the white king will lose territory little by little. For example, if king e3, king can move to c4 or c3, either one works. King needs to move again. Now black already is attacking the pawn. King f3 and king d3. All of a sudden, white is in a serious zugzwang, meaning it's about to lose material. White can no longer hang on to the pawn on e4, and after king f2, king takes e4, king g3. Sadly for white, they will not be able to hang on to the g4 pawn much longer either, because the king keeps getting in zugzwang after protects the pawn, king f4, and we achieved the same problem yet again. Let's go back all the way one more time and check out what could happen if black would play right now e4 and white would respond with king e3 instead of capturing the pawn. Well, the situation is pretty similar. Black would trade pawns and then move the king to d4 and slowly squeeze out the white king, just as we did in the previous variation. So after all these pawn endgames, I'm hoping that you get a little bit better idea on the importance of doubled pawns, as well as zugzwang, as well as the outside passed pawn. Very often we're using the outside passed pawn to lure the opponent's king, to keep it busy, make sure that outside passed pawn doesn't get promoted, and in the meantime, while the king is busy holding the pawn off, our own king is ready to run to the other side real quick and eat up all the pawns that are available to be captured. And now let's see the jewel of the week. As usual, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out the solution on your own before you listen to the solution. In this position, at first things seem pretty scary with the black pawn about to get promoted on the f-file. In addition, black also has an extra bishop. So what can be white's hope? Could it be the pawn on a6? Well, it certainly could. However, the problem is black already has his bishop positioned on g2 to hold off that pawn. Moreover, the black rook in the corner is also controlling the promotion square. So what can be white's hope? Well, give it some thought and then come back and listen to the answer. And that answer is white playing h6 first. Now things start looking quite a bit better very suddenly. After black's forced move, moving the king to g8, all of a sudden we see the black rook being imprisoned in the corner. The black rook has no moves whatsoever. Neither does the black king. However, there is still one more obstacle to overcome, and namely that f-pawn that seems to be unstoppable. Well, it is stoppable, but it will cost white his rook. So what to do? Well, white has no choice but make a move with the king, moving to e6. But the pawn is still ready to get promoted, and it does. Rook takes and bishop takes. So right now, black is up a rook and a bishop. That's a humongous advantage, especially when it comes to endgames. Moreover, when white plays a7, black is ready to immediately stop that pawn with bishop to g2. Amazingly, in this position, white is still saving the game. By the fine move of king e7 and locking in the black rook in the corner. Because the black king has no escape from g8, neither will the black rook. And interestingly, the black bishop is unable to put the white king in zugzwang, so that it would need to let the black king out of the corner. After b5, white will play b4. Let's say bishop a8. White would simply move down to e8. Move back and forth between e8 and e7. But what happens if black makes a waiting move, and after that the bishop returns to c6? Now the king can no longer go to e8. Isn't black winning now? If the pawn promotes, the bishop just captures it. Then after king e8, the bishop makes one waiting move, and then a second one, and now indeed black is winning, as after the king moves anywhere, the black king will come out, followed by the rook, escaping from the prison as well. So this is the key moment right here. Before we would give up our valuable pawn, white must play king d6. And now, if the bishop moves away from the attack, the white king simply moves back to e7, and we're back to square one. On the other hand, if instead black decides to give up on the bishop and let the rook out of the corner, then the white pawn is too far advanced, and white again will end up saving the game. If black would try to go after the pawn immediately, black would even get in trouble, because all of a sudden white would have a second passed pawn marching down real quick. And if black plays rook a8, not giving white the time to capture the b5 pawn, then comes king b7, and whether black takes the pawn immediately or moves the rook away and captures the newly born queen in the corner, both pawns will get promoted at the same time. Each side runs after the pawn, and now each side would start pushing the pawn h5, king c5, h4, b5, h3, b6, h2, b7, and right on time. Promote and promote. No skewer on sight, and therefore the game is draw. Hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame, as well as learned a lesson from the instructive pawn endgames we discussed in this lesson. Thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Take care. Bye-bye.